I think we are live. Just want to give it a minute. Great. Hi, everyone. I wanted to officially welcome everyone who is joining us today for this wonderful webinar. My name is Inaru Melendez. I'm with Hispanics in Philanthropy. And I just wanted to share that we do have interpretation available. So to activate the interpretation feature on Zoom, please find and click on the globe labeled interpretation and select the language you would like to hear. As an option, if you would not like to hear the original audio, click mute original. Bienvenidos a todos. Mi nombre es Inaru Meléndez de Hispanics in Philanthropy. Quisiera darle la bienvenida a este webinar increíble que vamos a tener, esta conversación. Tenemos interpretación disponible. Para activar la función de interpretación en Zoom, busca y haga clic en el globo etiquetado como interpretación. Ahí puedes seleccionar el idioma y adicionalmente, si no deseas escuchar el audio original, por favor, haz clic en silenciar original. Muchísimas gracias y ahora se lo paso a una. Thank you and I will pass it over to you.
Welcome. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to join you all for this very important conversation. My name is Una Osili. I am the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly Family School and also the Dean's Fellow for the Mays Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. I am so excited and honored to be joined by our distinguished panelists who have built, of course, the work that you'll be hearing about today. And I'll just give you a very quick high-level introduction, and their bios are in the program. We'll start with my wonderful colleague, Ana Marie Argilagos, who is the president and CEO of Hispanics in Philanthropy. Many of you know about her leadership in the sector, but also her contributions to lifting up Latino and Hispanic giving. And we also have joining us today, Henry Ramos, who is the senior fellow at the New School Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. He also has done extensive research on Hispanic philanthropy, and we are just honored that he's able to join us today. And we also have a third panelist, Isabelle Leighton, who is the executive director of the Donors of Color Network. So all three of them will be contributing to our discussion. I encourage all of you who've joined us today to send in your questions, your comments, your insights. We'd love to involve you, and you can use the Q&A button throughout the process, and we'll be fielding those questions as we receive them. And so to start off, I'd like to share just highlights of the new report on Understanding Latinx, Latine Philanthropy, which was just launched last week. And the timing coincides with, of course, Hispanic Heritage Month. What we learned during this project is while the Latine community is the fastest growing in the United States, making contributions across political, economic, and social spheres, the research on philanthropy is sparse. And so this report was launched to actually raise awareness and bring to the forefront many of the themes that we'll be covering today. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to share these brief highlights, and there will be a translation as well. So Inaru, I think you will be sharing the screen. Yes. Okay, so we have the full report available online for all of you who've gathered here to delve into. And today what we'd like to just cover very quickly, the methodology for the report, the key findings, and the implications. In terms of background, this project was really a partnership with Hispanics in Philanthropy. We launched the report. It was took more than a year of work. It includes both qualitative as well as quantitative work. We have case studies in the report. We also have focus groups. And so the goal was really to bring all of these perspectives in full view. We also worked closely with an advisory council to identify the research questions and draw out the main implications. So let's start with the methodology. We're going to go right to the next slide. The methodology draws on many different strands of work, including an extensive literature review, which brought to bear all the different work that has been done in the field. In particular, what we also understood is that the Latinx community is diverse, covers a range of countries of origin, cultural traditions, historic and even current day patterns. In addition, it was important to explore the role of immigration experience, time in the United States, and also family and community networks. So all of these perspectives were reflected in the qualitative data, the quantitative data, and the focus groups and case studies. Going to the next slide, I want to highlight the main research questions. The first question looks at what are the long-term giving trends among the Latinx community, the Latinx community in the United States. To answer this question, we have a unique data source at the Lilly Family School called the Philanthropy Panel Study. It is the longest running study of American philanthropy. It's also the largest and most comprehensive data set on American giving. To aid us in this work, the Philanthropy Panel Study has a refresher sample of new immigrants, as well as a Latinx oversample. And so we were able to draw on all these additional resources to answer this question of the long-term giving trends. In addition, at the Lilly Family School, we also conduct the high net worth study in partnership with Bank of America. And since 2016, have oversampled Latinx high net worth households. So we're able to bring that data source into the project. And then finally, the next research question was understanding that the Latinx community is very diverse. It includes individuals of all different backgrounds, immigration experiences, language preferences, religious orientation, but also variations in income, wealth, and economic experiences as well, and preferences. So we have to bring all of these perspectives into the analysis, and you'll see that we're able to do that in the research. So going to just summarize very quickly what the methodology entailed on the next slide. We draw on these large-scale national studies, but we also are able to drill down into focus groups to understand what that current status looks like today and what are the future directions in conversations with Latinx donors, philanthropic advisors, and nonprofit professionals. Now, there are some aspects of this work that, as you can imagine, are harder to delve into. And one area that kept coming up, especially as we developed the studies, how do we measure factors like trust, institutional affiliation, networks? And to do that, we also draw on the general social surveys conducted at the University of Chicago. And that brings a lot of information about trust patterns, how those vary among the Latinx community, and how it's changed over time. So with all of that as a background and framework, let's go right into the findings and highlight what the study found and what the implications are. So in this case, we had a lot, you can imagine, with a large-scale trend level analysis, also looking at the high net worth study and the qualitative findings. There's a lot to unpack. And so we had to, in one sense, really hold ourselves accountable for some key findings. And so if you want to read more, certainly the report is quite comprehensive. So I'll just quickly summarize. The first finding, and the one that I think will bring a lot of discussion, is we look over time at patterns of giving. And what we see is a very distinct trend where Latinx donors were increasing their overall giving rates. And we see this pretty much across the board. But around the time of the Great Recession, we see giving patterns start to decline. And actually, that decline has continued even after the Great Recession. When we compare this to everyday, this is for everyday households. So we look at non-Latinx households, we see the same pattern. In other words, giving rates were very stable prior to the Great Recession at 2/3 of American households giving at the start of the 21st century. It's down to about half of American households that give today. The big explanation for what we see with Latinx households, especially, is that the Great Recession had a significant and disproportionate impact on Latinx households, and that many minority households, in particular from ethnic minority groups, not only faced the economic shock differently, experienced the economic shock differently, but also faced a longer path to recovery in terms of labor income as well as non-labor income. So that's a big part of what we see. In fact, about 40% of the decline in giving rates is due to economic factors. The other segment is due to what we would term non-economic factors. That means trust levels are declining, and we see that, we'll see more about that. We see that in the data, but we also note that around the same time, for all Americans, in addition to declining rates of trust, we're also seeing lower rates of religious participation and affiliation and social capital formation. So with all of that as a background, I'd also like to lift up the main takeaway here is that we did see the impact of the economy on Latinx giving patterns and recovery being longer even after the Great Recession. So as we think about the future of Latinx giving, we know that economic factors are going to be important, but also how do we continue to build trust across the sector and with Latinx donors in particular. Moving to the next slide. I'd also like to highlight some other findings that are quite important as takeaways. First, when we look at Latinx donors, where they give, not just the percentages of giving, but how those donor dollars are being allocated. We know that values, faith, and family in particular are very important to Latinx donors. Many give because of the relationships, the networks, and the organizational connections that they have. We see this not just in their giving to organizations, but also in their giving to family members and community members. One of the findings that is so striking and very intriguing as we look at the data for Latinx households is that they are more likely to engage in informal giving compared to other households. This is actually true even when we control for income, education, age, marital status, and many other observable factors. So what does this mean? It means that informal giving, and this is giving to family, giving to community members, giving to non-household family members, is especially important for Latinx households. Relationships and personal relationships are a big factor when it comes to giving. And finally, when we look at the areas where Latinx households give to, where their charitable dollars are allocated to, the top destination is religious congregations, followed by basic needs charities, and then healthcare and medical research. Education ranks highly at number 4. And this is actually somewhat mirrors what we see for other types of households, with the exception being healthcare, medical research being very highly ranked for Latinx households compared to maybe other donors of color. Education may be slightly higher for some other communities. How do we want to think about all of these findings in terms of the future of Latinx giving in a time where there has been very significant change, the COVID pandemic, continued economic uncertainty that disproportionately affects Latinx households, and then finally an ongoing racial and social justice conversation? As we look at the next slide in terms of implications and findings, maybe we'll just go, one of the things we think about is how Latinx household patterns change with time in the US. For recent immigrants, we do find lower rates of giving, but as many of those households gain US experience, their giving rates and giving amounts tend to increase. Finally, we see Latinx donors, especially as they gain US experience, going beyond traditional ways of giving and moving to support a broader range of causes and organizations, including strategic investments in Latinx communities. For some Latinx donors, That also means funding advocacy and thinking about opportunities to influence policy rather than just on the charitable lens. In terms of implications and takeaways, today we have lots of interesting, I'd say, policy priorities, both at the national level and locally. As we think about this study and how that intersects with many of the issues of our time that affect Latinx communities, let's start with the basics. Family, faith, and community are three core principles that shape giving decisions for many Latinx households. And this is also part of how they make decisions, the areas they choose to allocate their charitable dollars to, and the future of giving for many Latinx donors actually starts with family, with faith, and community. Secondly, when we drill down into our focus group findings, we also noted that many donors and advisors emphasized and prioritized the need to shift towards strategic long-term investments in Latinx communities. What does that look like? For some donors, it's about engagement with the next generation of donors. For others, it's about advocacy and political involvement as well. And then finally, and probably importantly, as we think about the report, the term Latinx is an umbrella term that's used in the report, but we did get a lot of discussion about what the right terminology is and a recognition that the Latinx community is very diverse. It's diverse in terms of national origin, cultural traditions. It includes many different households. Some of them have been in the US for generations. Some are recent immigrants. And in terms of terminology, there's not even agreement about what the correct terminology should be. So as we go forward, I think one of the key takeaways is to recognize the diversity in the Latinx community, understand the shifts that are taking place, both at the aggregate level, but even within the community in terms of priorities and areas. There's also a lot of inspiration that's present in this report for nonprofits that are working with Latinx donors, but also for Latinx-led nonprofits to understand that this is a very generous community. You see that both in the formal giving and the informal giving, but also in the way that community comes together to address priorities. So I will stop here and we're going to go right to a panel. This is also a chance to thank all of the participants who contributed to this project, to Hispanics in Philanthropy for their partnership, but also to our focus group participants and many others. So right to the panel discussion, I'm going to start with Anna Marie and just ask her very quickly to tell us a little bit about how this project came to be, the launching of the reports, the conversations we had, and why you thought this was an important project for Hispanics in Philanthropy to work on.
Thank you, Una. So excited to be here with all of you. We've been working on this for over a year, and here we are. Why? And actually, I want to talk about why now as well, because we just kicked off last week Hispanic Heritage Month. And so we felt it was really important to celebrate our achievements as a community. And part of our achievements is our achievements as donors and givers. And I wanted to make sure that that was front and center in the community. And in a media and where there's narratives that too often portray us as takers, and we're not takers, as you show, we are very much givers. And so we've been watching for years the research that's been coming out of the Lilly School, the Donors of Color Network. It's amazing and groundbreaking, but still it wasn't deep enough in terms of Latinos because, as you said, we weren't oversampling for Latinos, Latinx. And so to a certain extent, we still felt a little bit invisible. We feel invisible no more because through this work, our stories and are now front and center in the conversation. And I think what we need to do next is continue to figure out how to unpack so that all of you on this webinar, everybody that's reading this, philanthropy in general, can redefine and how Latinos think about philanthropy and generosity. Through this, we can see how we are givers and how it looks a little bit differently. it's the most comprehensive, and I can't underscore this enough, Una, you mentioned it, the most comprehensive report to date. It looks at 20 years of data. And since you have several different methodologies, it really does give us that, that view into what we're doing. So I think what I want to leave you behind with is that it's just a snapshot, and we still have nuances that need to be unpacked, nuances by subgroup, like our Colombians, does that differ from, Puerto Ricans? Does that differ from Mexican Americans? So by subgroup, by regions, we still have to also do a lot of education. And that's why I'm really happy to be here on this first webinar, to be able to start sharing and getting this out in front of people.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you shared that perspective, and also the timing. Why now? The relevance, Hispanic Heritage Month, and bringing to the forefront that Latine donors are part of the American philanthropic journey and landscape. They are not new. They're not emerging donors, as my colleague Dr. Tyrone Freeman often says. They've been here along. We just haven't paid attention. So you've raised that point so well, and thank you for sharing that. We're going to turn our attention to Henry Ramos, who has been a pioneer in this work. In fact, he has conducted one of the first studies of Latinx giving. And actually, I want to bring you into this conversation on the why now and what you've seen in terms of changes over time, in particular COVID, as the COVID-related economic shocks have disproportionately affected Latinx households. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably because I see some comments coming through about terminology. So let's turn the Zoom floor over to you to share what have been those changes that you've observed. And in this moment, what are you seeing as the issues we need to lift up around Latinx generosity and philanthropy in light of some of these economic setbacks that Latinx communities have actually experienced?
Well, I want to thank you, Una, for the opportunity to engage, to be a part of today's conversation. I particularly want to acknowledge Ana Maria and her remarkable team at HIP and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University for all the good work that you all do, and for the audience for making time to join us in this important conversation. There's a lot to be said there, and we don't have a lot of time, but I think that, frankly, the decline in giving that is reflected in the data is probably the biggest headline that I'm taking away from the report. It's a solid report, and it does, bear mentioning that, as Ana Maria started, there's a lot of good news in terms of Latino engagement and giving. I think the big problem, as we've begun to acknowledge, is that so much of the giving is off the radar because it is informal family-directed giving, or it's remittance giving that is directed to family members in foreign nations from which our families come. But I think that, in particular, when you think about the profound dislocations that you cited stemming from the 2008 mortgage and banking meltdown, you can also, go to things like the sexual and financial abuse crises that have beset important faith communities, from the Catholic Church to many of the evangelical communities. These are all factors that I think have really had a bearing both for a practical set of reasons and also for a moral and ethical set of reasons to invoke perhaps a distrust and a lack of interest in engaging. Let's be honest, speak frankly, our communities are really beset right now. Economically, there's no question that the 2008 mortgage meltdown and the surrounding recession had a disproportionate impact on our people. We were overrepresented in the default population that lost their homes. And it's striking to say that, the data that I'm concerned about and reflecting on here does not even cover the COVID pandemic period, which I think you're correct to suggest is very likely going to show us still additional declines in Latinx giving. So I think that when we look at our overexposure in industries that have been affected by these massive economic hits that we've seen over the last couple of decades, we have to acknowledge that our people are highly exposed. We're in hospitality, we're in services, we're overrepresented in vulnerable industries all across the board, agriculture and other places. And I think that also, let's be candid, we have faced a very significant growth in very visible, visceral, anti-Latino, anti-immigrant sentiment that is largely directed to us. And I think the combination of economic dislocation and crisis that has disproportionately affected our populations, coupled with this growing vulnerability to the vagaries of a declining quality in our political discourse, has really soured our community's positioning and willingness really to engage. I think that the informal giving continues to be the marker of our signature in the space. But I think the good news is that owing to the work that we're talking about here today, the efforts over many years by organizations like Hispanics in Philanthropy, there is now a critical mass of Latino and Latina leadership in the philanthropic and nonprofit sector. We certainly need to do more, and I'll say more about that in later parts of the conversation. But I would say that, finally, in response to all the things that we've just mentioned, I just want to underscore the importance of investing in more actionable research of the kind that HIP and the Lilly School have made possible for our conversation today, because without more clear and informing data on the issues and the opportunities that we face in advancing a more robust Latin engagement in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, it's very unlikely that we will see any rise in our ability to galvanize around the many challenges that our communities face.
I love that. So you've given us a call to action as well. We need to continue investing in the research. But one point that I want to underscore that you just raised is that conversations about philanthropy and generosity have to be had alongside issues of economic empowerment, building wealth in our communities, and supporting leadership in organizations like the diverse leadership that we're seeing at HIP and in other places. These are all great points and ones that I think are worth emphasizing in this environment, as we said, that is still a very uncertain and you could say challenging environment for many communities of color. So this is a great point to turn over to Isabelle. What is the opportunity to organize and build coalitions with this donors of color, drawing on a power building lens? So we've talked about the generosity that's inherent in the Latinx community, Latinx community. We've also talked about the timing, the relevance. These are issues that cannot wait. The time is now. And a conversation about wealth and building an economic base. You do the research on donors of color more broadly. So share with us what's taking place now, and especially some of the efforts around building power, organizing, and bringing communities together.
Thank you, Una, for this question. I love how my first question is just diving right into this. This is a great one. No messing around here. So I want to just first say thank you so much for inviting Donors of Color Network to this conversation. As some of you may know, we are the new kids on the block in terms of organizing within communities of color in philanthropy. Hispanics in philanthropy. This is an inspiring moment for you all. And of course, you've been leaders in so long. So thank you, Ana Mari, for inviting us. And then I myself have also been part of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in philanthropy in the past. So I have had a front seat to a lot of the types of discrepancies in funding that we all face across different communities. But at Donors of Color Network, or I'll use DOCN as an acronym, we enter into this conversation from a slightly different angle, right? So one of the spaces that we really have been starting our work, we've only been around for 4 years. We were founded in 2019, really comes to the place of what happens when you bring communities together across races, across sectors, and across issue areas of interest, right? Because part of what we're interrogating is the power dynamics that happen within philanthropy, right? So once you go into the more seasoned spaces of philanthropy or the more mainstream spaces of philanthropy, you start to see fewer and fewer people of color in leadership and decision-making positions. And given that so many of the members that we've recruited, and I know that it was referenced earlier in this call that we did also produce a report. It's called Philanthropy Always Sounds Like Someone Else, a portrait of high net wealth people of color. It precisely feels that way. The philanthropy that we bring to the table as communities of color are grounded in our traditions of generosity that have existed for centuries in completely different spaces that are just largely invisible. And so we entered at Donors of Color Network into the space of philanthropy with a few problems that we knew needed to be solved. First, that there is not enough money going to communities of color. A lot of the wisdom and the fantastic power building work that's already happening in the community is doing it on just the slimmest of margins, the tiniest amount of money, and we're winning. We're winning in so many different places. There are so many stories of great success and achievement for communities of color, yet we're not funding like we want our communities to win. And of course, when you look at the study that, this decline in the giving in the Latine community, that's only just a sliver of the broader story, right? And so that's how we were inspired to start a lot of our work. The way that we think about power building is first to really think about how individuals can be more strategic and effective with their giving, right? And so looking at how is my giving actually connected to the type of civic engagement I want to see, the type of power building we want to see in this society. A lot of that looks like democracy work. For many of our members, that really sits in more of the education space. Any issue area has a branch that is focused on building power and changing systems so that we can lessen the gap between folks who are people of color and folks who are representing more of the mainstream communities, right? And so this could look like language access. This could look like representation in different leadership roles. There's a variety of those spaces. And so we're really focusing on how do we increase the dollars that go to communities just as a baseline. And then what does it look like to have leaders in some of these spaces who can boldly speak to what type of biases may be happening within the halls of philanthropy? And we are just at the beginning of this, right? And I'll just share a little bit of some of the questions that have come up at Donors of Color Network since we started, right? How do we ensure that with the wealth gap that is real, that Henry shared with us, very real that cuts across many communities of color, how do we advance our philanthropy knowing that this wealth gap is not getting smaller? How do we hold that line? That is a really big question. And there's no way that we're going to be able to compete with mainstream philanthropy if we don't do it together, if we don't find some way to work in community. But that brings up a separate question. How do we come to a place of cross-racial solidarity? How do we create policies and advance strategies that help all of us? I don't have the answers to that completely, but it's a work that invite all of us who are leaders in communities of color working in philanthropy to wrestle with and to think about, right? Because we do have very unique needs, and we all have to make sure that those needs are put on the table, but also that we're growing the pie together.
Fantastic. So Isabelle, you've just kind of raised the level of conversation here to say we need to tackle both the issues within communities, but also the issues that bind communities together. So Latinx, Latin communities have a lot in common with other communities of color, and addressing whether it's wealth and power building, the resources that are being allocated to communities, that we need to also be watching those metrics and the leadership side of things. And here, I'm very happy to share that we have had the opportunity to work with leaders across different communities on some of these questions already. And you'll hear more specifically from Anna Marie about how she has been tackling those questions. So we're going to come back to you, Anna Marie, and specifically say what ways can this conversation really open up a broader set of questions in the philanthropic sector. So Isabelle has set up a very nice sort of segue here. Specifically, what are those pieces of data here that can broaden the conversation on philanthropy? And I'll mention a few things. First, informal giving stood out in this report, that Latin communities are essentially punching above their weight is the way I would describe it, because they're giving more than their counterparts in other communities when we take into account everything that's going to family, to community members, and to charitable organizations. Does that change how we think about and measure philanthropy first? And in the conversations, in the Q&A webinar chats, we're seeing a lot of people ask about remittances, which we haven't explicitly talked about, but that's also a very significant part of the experiences that we're talking about, where immigrants are helping their families and their communities in their country and communities of origin. And then finally, this is a big theme throughout the conversations we had, the focus groups, is this idea that philanthropy needs to meet Latin donors where they are, engage with them, not just as a source of funding, not just as a pool of volunteers, but really understanding the values, the preferences, the motivations. And so I'm going to put this back in your court. This report helps us expand our understanding of philanthropy by bringing all of these perspectives to the forefront. So what should all of philanthropy be taking away from today's conversation?
You said everything I was going to say, because I think the most important thing that the philanthropic sector can do is exactly that: meet us where we are at and not try and fit us and put us into something, a different bucket. And I think, I mean, I've seen this from Isabelle's reports as well, this tendency towards informal giving. You see this in the AAPI community, you see this in the Black community, you see this in the Native American community, you see them, you see it also there. So this is a trend that I think all of philanthropy would benefit if we look at Latine and at other BIPOC, recognizing we're very generous, but our generosity is directly related to our culture and our values, grounded in family, much more relational, much more intergenerational, and looking at family, neighbors, and community. And so you mentioned mutual aid. And so, yeah, we saw this 5 years ago when I came onto HIP. It was Hurricane Maria, and we saw it was mutual aid. We saw this during COVID and the pandemic, all the different natural disasters that we've been experiencing. We saw it during the 2009 recession. So it's not something new. You know, the trends go way back. And so this informal giving is really important to study, because the issue of remittances, which came up in the chat, the issue of crowdfunding, digital giving circles, how we can potentially harness the power of community foundations. I think our folks would very much gravitate towards community foundations if we had more on-ramps into how to use them. But I think that since what we've been doing as a Latine community is not captured by tax data, because it's not driven by tax deductions, that's not our driver. And we have this natural apprehension more than others of big institutions. The on-ramps have not been on there for us to be able to engage in ways that I think would, if they were there, really accelerate and exponentially. And so I would invite us to think about that for the next phase, about all of the nuances, and to get more curious to unpack. Sorry, I think I'll stop there.
Awesome. So you're lifting up an issue that I think all of us can think about, and we'd love to get more folks interested in this topic, is really thinking about the engagement opportunities, the on-ramps, the vehicles that are available to Latinx communities that perhaps are underutilized. How do we start to build bridges within communities, but also across communities? And some of these items are very practical. Anna Maria, you okay? Yes. Okay, perfect. Well, we will come back to you because you have such a wealth of knowledge and experience on this topic. But I want to turn to Henry. I am so intrigued by the fact that you've been working on these questions for decades in terms of the data, in terms of the qualitative work. And as Anna Marie said, some of these issues are not new. Informal giving didn't just start in the COVID era. It's been going on for centuries. The remittances, the linkages with home communities have been there for centuries as well. So what is surprising about this report that everyone here should pay attention to and take away in terms of calls to action? What really perhaps got your attention as you delved into the data and the qualitative components?
Well, I mean, I think that, it's important that we're acknowledging that things like remittances and informal giving are not unique to the Latino or Latinx community. This is something that virtually every, particularly immigrant population to the United States, since its incipiency, has engaged in. It is the first step in terms of like interfacing with what becomes a more formal stake in the space. What I would say is that it's not so much surprising, because I think at the evolutional stage that we're at as a community, we're still, we're in formation. But in light of some of the political and economic stresses that I alluded to in my earlier comments, it strikes me that this is a very critical time for us to not lose the informal, but to amplify and build on the informal with much more formal ways of showing up in the philanthropic space. And to do that, we need some help. It's not something that we can do all alone by ourselves. I believe when you look at other communities that have been in their own ways through this evolutional cycle, if you look at the Jewish American community, or you look at the African American community, or women as donors, all of these communities have begun with the informal, but they have kind of taken much more visible formal leadership in the space, principally not just to do good, that's always the first instinct, but also to elevate our economic and our political voice, to exercise, dare I say, power. And I think that the Latina community is in a place of vulnerability right now that is so critical, that we need to be, frankly, much more intentional, much more strategic, and much more purposeful about the way that we use philanthropy, not just as a way of mitigating the damages and harms of our society and economy and politics, but to change the rules of the game so that those wounds are not present, to elevate our best assets, to draw on the power of our art, our culture, our multiracial dynamic, which I think are unique qualities at a time in American evolution that those qualities are really called for. So, when I look at a state like California, where I live, I look at a state that has 40% of our population Latine. And I look at the foundation leadership of our state, and I can name 3 Latino or Latina foundation CEOs. And when I look at the nonprofit sector, the numbers are not that much better. That kind of disconnect is dangerous for our culture and society. It's not only bad for us as Latino people, it is also invoking a ticking time bomb in terms of adding the potential for more social, economic, and political pressures in our future if we don't build on the assets that we represent, and also harness the inherent enthusiasm that we bring to everything that we do. We are ready, willing, and able. We have demonstrated that, we don't need necessarily to have a new set of leadership programs. We don't necessarily need to have a new kind of frame of educational exposure to kind of how to be a leader or how to make change. We have incredible capacity in those spaces. What we need is our allies in other spaces to join forces with us to really invest in our future in a way that serves the common good, in a way that really lifts all boats. Because if we don't do that, I think not only do we lose as a society, I think the larger American economy and society will lose. And I don't think that, if you look at the last 6, 7, 8 years of our history, it is not overdramatic to say that we are in a precipice moment. We are in a moment where our nation needs to define, will we continue to be an inclusive, multicultural society that is one that is inviting of all of our talents, or will we become a closed society where only a specific kind of people in a certain racial category and a certain class category can have the benefits of what we call the American dream? And I think that we are pivotal as a community in determining what that future looks like. We are doing our part. We need others to meet us more than halfway to get the job done.
Excellent, powerful set of points. And I'll just recap by saying, I think you've put a stake in the ground to say, we know what the data tell us. The Latinx community is generous. It has so many assets to offer. It's time for the rest of the sector to step up to essentially make sure that these voices, as you said, 40% of the population, we don't see that in leadership, we don't see that reflected in the foundation and nonprofit spaces. So you're putting the ball in everyone's court. We all have work to do to make sure that the power part of the philanthropy is elevated. So I think I have taken those points, lots to work on for all of us. This is a shared mission. And that takes us right to Isabelle. One point that the report makes, and also I think it's inherent in the discussion today, is Latin donors and populations are the youngest demographic we have in the United States, not just the fastest growing, but also the youngest. So it's no surprise that in every focus group, one theme that was reflected is the need to engage the next generation of Latin donors, of activists, power builders, all of that, but also noting that young people have their own set of priorities, their own preferences, as well as a set of perhaps maybe there's a disconnect sometimes with what the older generations are interested in, what the younger counterparts want. So back to this idea of how do we engage the next generation, because the future will depend on it. So you have the larger perspective from the donors of color research and work that you're doing. How should philanthropy, and this is looking across the sector, foundations, nonprofits, all of the philanthropy, what should they prioritize as they seek to engage the next generation of Latin donors, recognizing that their priorities might be quite different? This came through in the focus groups, the things that they're concerned about may be quite different from what their parents or grandparents care about.
This is a fantastic question that, again, I think all of us are, pulling at the threads of trying to figure out. But I will say the best advice and recommendation and a call to action, I would say, is to make sure it's a two-way street, right? The type of mentorship and wisdom that we want to share as those of us who are a little more seasoned in philanthropy or our careers, share that information, right? I'm so inspired by the type of research you're bringing to this conversation, Henry, in talking about the wealth gaps. The type of economic and financial pressure the next generation is facing couldn't be more broad. We have, on some cases, some of these individuals are making more money than any of their ancestors would have ever imagined. Founding companies just because of their pure invention and, great thinking and just looking at a problem. And then some who never believed that they're ever going to be able to have a family or buy a home if that's what they were choosing to do. That's a painful reality for the next generation to be living in, right? And so being able to let them have the space to share their anger, to share their inspiration, and to share the spaces that they haven't had a chance to actually talk about, right? So when you have an individual, sometimes I like to say, when you get on a call, how many of you had the dream that you're going to buy your mother a house when you get rich, right? Like that is such a common thing in communities of color as folks are building their wealth. And if we are not in a two-way conversation about what our values are, what stories you're bringing as a younger generation, what stories you have seen in your fight to get to the top as a person who now has the power and the wealth, which is like, a proxy to power in a lot of different spaces, building that intergenerational connection, I think, is the first part, right? And I think telling stories and not being ashamed of telling those stories is definitely one. The other piece that I would say is that, and this goes because it's an extremely challenging type of work right now, is to figure out how to develop spaces where decision-making can be shared, right? There are places where, for example, in a giving circle, there's no age to most giving circles. You just participate, right? Why not bring your children to be part of that conversation? And I saw in the study, and it's the same story with all of our work as well, that we like to have family or intergenerational conversations. And in some cases, there's a chosen family, right? The folks that you feel a little bit more aligned to in your values. Being able to say that the space is all about creating those connections is very important. And then the final thing I would say is going back to the wealth building question, right? There is a reality that people of color face. in the fact that we are new to this institutional philanthropy, right? This is one of those places where looking at the tools within wealth management and financial management are very new. And we don't want to put ourselves in a position where we start to get bogged down and lose the incredible stories of our own types of giving and our own types of cultures, because we now have a seat at the table in some of these spaces. And so that's another part of the work we need to do, because I will tell, since we did open the door a little bit to some of the democratic giving and the political giving, I will say that anecdotally, we did run a very short fund last year at Donors of Color Network during the midterm elections. And we learned that once our members had the opportunity to give to across different tax statuses, they were not specifically only focused on C3 or tax deductible types of giving. And in fact, people of color, at least from our very, very small data set of 19 donors, which equated to around $300,000 to 26 organizations, that we had a higher percentage of people who willingly gave to other communities that were new to them, and also to different types of tax statuses like C4, because they knew once I heard the story of the need, it was very easy to just say, okay, I could do more this time, right? And that does not exist in some of the more institutionalized philanthropy, right? And that is, we don't want to lose what makes our community special and powerful, because we now have the ability to be in more of these institutional spaces.
Fantastic. So one point that you are lifting up is the need to expand the opportunities and the options available. Younger donors may want to support movements, political organizing, advocacy, provide more options, and also bring the assets that we have in our community to the forefront. I love one of the chat points here. Her daughter, we have a participant audience member that just mentioned that her daughter joined the Giving Circle and has already donated some of her own money at age 7. So there is no bar here. People at all different ages can be part of philanthropy. And we already see that in many of our communities. It's more about how do we recognize and build on the assets that already exist. So it sounds like we have so many questions coming in. I don't know if we'll have time to get into all of them, but I wanted to do a quick round to our panelists to ask them if there is one thing that our audience should take away today for the institutions they work for. And just looking at the folks that have joined us, some of them are community foundations, some are Latinx-led nonprofits, some work within the Latinx community, others are coming as allies and supporters. What is one thing they should do differently that you are seeing in today's conversation and report? And if we have time, after this one thing, we will open it up to see if we can take a few of those questions. So Anna Marie, we're going to start with you because you do this all the time. You share ideas for the future. So we're going to give you the first word.
Okay, great. So galvanize. So we need more research so that we can get into the nuances. So those of you that are funders or academics in the audience, please pay attention that there's still lots of gaps, even though we have this great snapshot. And those of you that are working with community foundations, family foundations, all donor advisors, think about how we build these on-ramps, these pipelines. Yes, we have giving circles. There's great ones like the Latino Community Foundation. Those of you that are in California, we have Philanthropy Together, which is doing great work. And now we have more kinds of things, like we have digital giving circles. So you don't have to do the giving circles in person. You can do them digitally, or you have the crowdfunding. We have Hip Give, which is crowdfunding and it's bilingual. But look at these and encourage more of these, especially these community foundations that are thinking about numbers, like bigger assets under management is the metric for success. Flip that and think about creating a movement of givers. So instead of like how much millions of dollars do we have, how many millions of people that are giving small numbers, and that is just as valuable as the assets under management. So a reframing.
Wonderful. So we need to redefine and reframe and expand our definitions here based on the report. Henry, over to you. You can see there are lots of questions coming in, but one thing
Yes.
that we should do different?
Well, I mean, I think it's two sides of the coin. Quickly, I think if you're a funder or a nonprofit leader, the onus is on you to reach out, to address us on terms that we understand, to speak to us in our language, to, as Anna-Maria said, honor our traditions and don't blow them up, build on them. On our side, we need to be less nice and less quiet. Frankly, in the nature of democracy, you got to make some noise. It's as John Lewis once told us, you got to make some good trouble. It's time.
Wow. So make some noise, make good trouble, but also you're putting a lot of responsibility on nonprofits, community foundations, family foundations to do the work, to actually reach out to communities, meet them where they are. A very practical question I think we heard, and I'm going to ask you that before we go on to Isabelle, is what can we do with the informal giving? Is there any language or a call that you would have to organizations that are thinking about how do we galvanize informal giving in formal ways? Are there pipelines, opportunities, even ideas that you've seen organizations use? And I'll just mention that because it's come up maybe 3 or 4 times in the Q&A and also in the chat.
Is that for me?
That's for you. If you have
great.
an idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some organizations like some of our Latino funds and foundations that are beginning to find constructive ways to build on those remittances and to kind of help capture what is involved in them. And I think the research really needs to be kind of more nuanced. As Anna-Maria said, there's a lot of other spaces and places where we can kind of dive in and pick up that data and lift it up out of the darkness into the light so we understand how to really make best and highest use of that kind of giving in a way that is more visible to people outside of our community.
Wonderful. And Isabelle, I'm going to come to you and I'll ask you one of the quick questions before you say your one thing. So another of the questions that came up specifically is education is not as high as you might have expected, given the importance of education for mobility. And you've worked in donors of color, research more broadly. Any thoughts on why education perhaps is lower ranked compared to some of the others? And then your one piece of advice for fundraisers, community foundations, other foundations, nonprofits that are working in communities.
Yeah, I think it's interesting about education because it depends on how you define it, right? In some cases, some people think of it as higher education, and some people think of it as how do we invest in the public education and the systems that are enabling us to have more access in society. I would say that there could be discouragement in how those systems have actually benefited the Latin community, and that we really need to step up as a community to really make sure that those systems are actually benefiting communities and that they don't continue to be spaces where folks are feeling oppressed. And that is a very large statement, but of course, backed up by many, many anecdotes and data, right? And the performance levels. And it shouldn't be seen as like the one special student who happens to exceed. It should be seen as we are all trying to support all of our communities, right? And I'm also in California, Henry, I'm in Fresno. And so, grew up in the Central Valley, and very much as an Asian American who grew up with Latinx and Latine communities. I saw this firsthand growing up. Yeah, and I'm happy to have more conversation on that topic in particular. Una, it is not one of the top issues where we started our work at Donors of Color Network. We've started on climate and democracy, but we will be starting the conversation on education and, of course, addressing the wealth gap. But on the topic of what the takeaway is, I mean, I was incredibly humbled and inspired by this report. Again, a huge round of applause for you all who have contributed to the report. I am focusing on my learning journey as a leader within philanthropy and know that I need to invite all of my colleagues and peers to do the same and to really step up and make sure that we amplify the need here for the research. I absolutely agree that we need more of this. This is a perfect demonstration project of what there is to offer once you do this type of research. I will say the other piece that I personally would be interested in is as you interact with and identify who those outspoken leaders are within your spaces of Latinx and Latine philanthropy, I would love for them to participate and join in with our communities across the variety of different racial and ethnic groups that we're organizing at Donors of Color Network, not just because we need the representation, but because we need to think differently about what the needs are, right? This isn't just about checking the box to say we have some percentage of folks from certain communities. This is about, I want to learn what your traditions of mutual aid look like. I want to learn what communities are doing that don't show up in the mainstream reports, right? Tell us the stories, give us, advise us, right? And so I would say we as a philanthropy need to open our minds a little bit more, to think a little bit more creatively about who we're leaving out of the conversation. And this report definitely has shown that. So thank you so much for doing that. And I will be speaking about the report in other spaces.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much. I just want to use this opportunity to thank all of our panelists. Virtual round of applause for all of you, our audience members who joined us, and Hispanics in Philanthropy, the fantastic team at HIP, for organizing this webinar, for leading the charge on this report, and also bringing all of us to this conversation, asking us to do more. And I think this is really the takeaway from me. We can all be part of the solution and changing the narrative. So with that, thank you to all of you who've joined, and I'll turn it back over to Hispanics in Philanthropy, to Inaru, for the final word.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is really exciting. Stay tuned for more to come, and please keep your questions and your thoughts coming. We'd love to engage in this conversation with you. Visit us at www.hipfunds.org, and that's a great place to start. And with that, we'll tune off.